I smoothed the silk of my dress, feeling the fine, cool fabric cling to my skin. An expensive, foreign skin I had temporarily borrowed. It was a designer label, a deliberate, defensive choice, meant to signal my belonging. Yet standing here, amidst the true artifacts of inherited power, I felt utterly exposed, a fake diamond among emeralds. The Vanderlings' Fifth Avenue mansion wasn't merely a residence. It was a fortress of established lineage, a monument to wealth so old it had calcified into history. And I, Clara Miller, was the uncomfortable, temporary exhibit, the anomaly placed under the harsh glare of their antique chandeliers. Every detail in that ballroom screamed exclusivity. The air itself felt thick and heavy, saturated with the faint, dusty scent of centuries of privilege. My gaze swept over the walls, paneled in dark, glossy wood that seemed to absorb all sound, making the polite chatter feel distant and menacing. Above me, the ceiling was a fresco depicting some forgotten mythological scene gods and goddesses looking down with the same cool, judgmental detachment as the guests below. I knew I'd earned my place in the world. My degrees were hard-won. My career trajectory was steep and self-made. But tonight, surrounded by generations of unchallenged old money, I felt every single slight, every whispered judgment, every assumption about my origins pressing down on my shoulders. I took a sip of the champagne, the bubbles doing nothing to dispel the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. The guests were a homogeneous sea of impeccable tailoring and subtle, yet blindingly expensive, jewelry. They moved with a languid confidence, a shared understanding of unspoken rules that I could never fully grasp. They were predators who didn't need to show their claws. Their mere presence implied danger. My primary source of discomfort, however, was not the room, but the person I loved, and the person I loved most. I watched my mother Maria across the vast expanse of polished marble floor. I had bought her the dresses simple, elegant sapphire blue that perfectly complemented her silvering hair, but her posture was stiff, almost painfully formal. She was trying so hard to be invisible, to be perfect, to protect me from the inevitable social cost of her presence. I knew she felt the oppressive weight of the room even more keenly than I did. And then I saw it. Mrs. Vanderlink, the matriarchal woman whose face was preserved by expensive serums, but whose eyes were sharp and unforgiving, lanced across the room. Her gaze lingered on my mother for a fraction of a second too long, a cold assessment that dismissed her entire existence. Then, she immediately turned to whisper something to a crony, a woman draped in enough diamonds to fund a small nation. Mrs. Vanderlink covered her mouth with a hand, but the gesture was too late. The look of amused contempt had already been registered. I knew exactly what they were thinking. It was the constant, low-level hum of pain I had tried desperately to tune out for months. Asterisk, the help. Asterisk, they tolerated me because Ethan loved me. Or at least, claimed to. I was the necessary evil, the ambitious interloper who had managed to catch the air. But they treated my mother with thinly veiled contempt, assuming her modest, quiet background meant she had been a domestic servant. The assumption was a constant, deep ache. My mother had worked tirelessly, yes, but she had done so with dignity, not servitude. The Vanderlinks, in their arrogance, couldn't conceive of a life where dignity wasn't bought. They reduced her entire history, her sacrifices, to a single, insulting category. The sting of that assumption was almost physical. It was the price of admission to this gilded cage, and it felt too high. I turned away, trying to regulate my breathing. I needed to find Ethan. He was my anchor. The reason I was enduring this suffocating performance? I finally spotted him near the fireplace, talking to his younger sister. Ethan was handsome, undeniably charming, possessing that easy, unearned grace that comes from knowing you are always safe. But tonight, he was utterly useless. He was smiling nervously, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding my gaze whenever his mother drifted near. He was performing his own tightrope walk, attempting to balance his affection for me with his lifelong subservience to the family name. I tried to reassure myself, as I had done countless times, that his love was genuine and powerful, emotional bridge over the enormous chasm of class difference separating us. But tonight, the bridge felt like it was crumbling, the foundations shifting under the relentless pressure of their disapproval. When I finally reached him, I placed a hand lightly on his arm, seeking physical reassurance. His muscles were tense beneath the expensive wool of his tuxedo. "Are you all right?" I whispered, keeping my voice low and pleasant, the mask firmly in place. He offered a quick, strained smile. "Perfectly fine, Clara. Just a lot of people. Your mother and her friends are discussing Maria," I stated, keeping my tone neutral, testing him. Ethan's eyes flickered toward the corner where the matriarch stood. He immediately looked back down at his champagne flute, polishing the rim with his thumb. Clara, please. It's an engagement party. They're discussing everyone. Just ignore them. It's only a few more hours. Asterisk, ignore them. Asterisk, that was always Ethan's solution. Retreat. Deny, survive, by minimizing the insult. He didn't understand that ignoring their malice was akin to accepting their premise that my mother, and, by extension, I, were fundamentally lesser. His failure to defend us, even in this small, private moment, was a cold splash of reality. He wasn't a knight, he was a hostage of his own inheritance. I pulled my hand back, a sharp realization forming in the pit of my stomach. I was fighting a war for dignity, and he was only fighting for peace. The air was thick with unspoken rules and expectations. Every movement I made, every word I spoke, felt scrutinized and judged. I felt the immense weight of the Vanderlinks' history pressing down on me, a heavy velvet curtain threatening to smother me. This house didn't want to welcome me. It wanted to assimilate me, to strip away my self-made identity and replace it with a watered-down version acceptable for their lineage. I watched a footman, immaculate in white gloves, circulate with a tray of delicate canapes. He moved with a practiced invisibility that I envied. He was paid to be invisible. I was expected to be a spectacle, yet equally disposable. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity. The tension in the room wasn't just social, it felt strategic. They were waiting for me to falter, to show my lack of breeding, to confirm their worst suspicions. I held my chin high, maintaining the facade of confidence, but inside, I was a coiled spring of dread. I focused on my mother again. She was standing near a marble pedestal holding a ridiculously ornate vase. She looked like a portrait of quiet endurance. I knew she was doing this for me, sacrificing her comfort, enduring the subtle, corrosive cruelty of the Vanderlinks, because she believed in my happiness with Ethan. Her sacrifice made the potential humiliation all the more unbearable. I saw Mr. Vanderlink, Ethan's father, a man whose thin smile never quite reached his eyes, tapping a spoon against his glass. The sound, a high, clear asterisk, clink asterisk, cut through the ambient noise like a warning bell. The toasts were coming. My stomach knotted so tightly I thought I might be sick. This was the moment of ritualized acceptance, but I knew, intrinsically, that it would be used as a moment of public definition. They wouldn't praise my accomplishments. They would patronize my efforts. They would remind everyone, politely but firmly, of the vast social gulf I had supposedly crossed, and how lucky I was to be allowed on their side. I just needed to survive the next hour. I needed to maintain my composure, protect my mother from any open insult, and then retreat to the safety of our small, shared apartment where authenticity wasn't a luxury. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to draw strength from the sheer defiance of my presence here. I was Clara Miller. I was smart, successful, and I deserved happiness. Their wealth didn't negate my worth. But in this room, under the crushing weight of their contempt, that inner conviction felt fragile, a tiny candle flame threatened by a gale. The first toast began, a bland offering from an old family friend. Then, another, equally tepid. I kept my eyes fixed on Ethan, willing him to be strong, willing him to be the man I thought I loved, the man who could stand up to this suffocating expectation. He smiled, he nodded, he played the part of the dutiful son. But his gaze still avoided mine, a silent admission of his impotence. The realization settled over me, cold and heavy. I was fighting this battle alone. My mother and I were two islands of real emotion in a sea of polished indifference, and the tide was rising. I braced myself, knowing the worst was yet to come. The air felt charged, expectant. The gilded cage was about to snap shut. I just prayed I could pull my mother out before the true damage was done. The mounting dread was an unbearable weight, pressing me down, waiting for the moment when the polite mask would finally slip, and the true cruelty would be unleashed. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next speaker would bring the reckoning. Chapter 2. The shattering glass, the sharp, crystalline sound of silverware, tapping against a glass cut through the low hum of conversation, signaling the beginning of the end. It was a familiar ritual at these Vanderlink affairs, the obligatory toasts. The carefully chosen words meant to celebrate an occasion, while subtly reinforcing the family's untouchable status. I gripped the stem of my own champagne flute, the glass cold and slick against my palm, a tiny island of reality in the swirling sea of silk and ancient money. I felt the knot of dread I had carried all evening tighten into a hard, painful lump beneath my ribs. My gaze instinctively darted to Ethan. He was seated beside me, handsome and impeccably tailored, but his usual easy confidence was absent. He looked like a man expecting a firing squad, not celebrating his engagement. He offered me a weak, almost apologetic smile, but his eyes were already avoiding mine, focused instead on the glittering chandelier overhead. He knew what was coming. We both did. This evening was not about celebrating us. It was about the Vanderlinks asserting their boundaries. A few lukewarm toasts passed, delivered by distant cousins and business associates who spoke of mergers of families and fortifying legacies. Each speaker was careful, their compliments toward me sounding rehearsed and hollow, like poorly forged coins. I managed to maintain a polite, unreadable expression, a skill I had perfected over the months of navigating this treacherous social terrain. Then, the true reckoning arrived. Ethan's cousin Veronica rose from her seat at the head table. I felt an immediate, visceral clench in my stomach. Veronica wasn't just a guest. She was the self-appointed guardian of the Vanderlink social order, a predator cloaked in the latest Chanel couture. Her smile, usually sharp and predatory, was now sickeningly sweet, a mask of false sincerity that only amplified my fear. I tried one last time to catch Ethan's attention, a silent, desperate plea for solidarity, for him to stand up, to interrupt, to do anything to shield us. But he remained frozen, his gaze fixed rigidly on the bubbles rising in his champagne flute, a statue of impending cowardice. His silence was already a betrayal, a chilling premonition of the abandonment I was about to endure. Veronica began her speech, her voice carrying easily through the cavernous ballroom. She started innocently enough, speaking of family history and the weight of tradition. I listened, my muscles rigid, translating her polished aristocratic language in real time. She was setting the stage, building a narrative where I was the foreign object, the imperfection in their otherwise flawless tapestry. We all know, she purred, drawing out the words with theatrical grace, that the Vanderlink name is not just a name. It is a responsibility, a legacy that requires careful stewardship. I felt the temperature drop in the room. The initial murmurs of appreciation had faded, replaced by an expectant, focused silence. Every eye, cold, critical, and utterly devoid of warmth, was on me. She continued, weaving a thread of saccharine praise for Ethan, emphasizing his commitment to duty and the importance of preserving pedigree. The air was suddenly thick, suffocating. I felt the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out the softer sounds of the party. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, frantic and loud, a desperate bird trapped in my chest. I knew where she was going. I knew the blow was imminent. My focus flew to my mother, Maria, across the table. She was trying so hard to appear serene, to meet the scrutiny with dignity. But I could see the tremor in her hands as she rested them in her lap. I had bought her the best dress I could afford. But in this room, against this backdrop of generational wealth, she looked heartbreakingly vulnerable. Veronica paused, taking a slow sip of water, drawing out the tension until it was almost unbearable. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, taking on a sneering, theatrical drawl that was meant to be amusing, but was purely vicious. And while we are all thrilled that Ethan has finally found someone to share his life with, she delivered the line with a patronizing tilt of her head. We must remember the importance of supporting him in maintaining his station. After all, we wouldn't want the Vanderlinks to be known for marrying the... She let the word hang in the air, a cruel, dangling participle, before delivering the final, devastating punchline. Double quotes, ... the Maid's daughter, *. The ensuing silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a physical force, a vacuum that sucked the air and light out of the room. It was deafening, sickening, absolute. For a horrifying moment, I thought I might physically shatter. The sting of the insult was immediate, a blinding flash of white-hot shame. But it wasn't the shame of my own background that wounded me most. It was the targeted cruelty aimed at my mother. The accusation that she had been a domestic servant to a respectable profession, but one they used as a weapon, was a calculated attempt to strip her of her quiet, earned dignity. My immediate, agonizing focus flew to Maria. I watched, helpless, as the carefully maintained composure on her face fractured. Her chin began to tremble uncontrollably, and the mask of polite indifference she had worn all evening dissolved. Fat, uncontrollable tears welled up and began streaming down her cheeks, carving paths through the faint powder she wore. She wasn't weeping hysterically. She was weeping silently, profoundly, the kind of crushing sorrow that comes from a lifetime of fighting to maintain respect only to have it brutally snatched away in an instant. That sight, my mother's utter, exposed heartbreak, was the breaking point. The pain was unbearable, A sharp, searing agony that eclipsed my own humiliation. This wasn't just a social slight. It was an act of public violence against the woman who had sacrificed everything for me. My instinct was primal: protection. I lunged slightly, reaching across the small space separating me from Ethan, searching for his hand, his support, his defense. I needed him to stand up right then, to shout, to declare his love, to refute the slander with the force of his commitment. But his hand was limp and unresponsive beneath mine. I looked at him, pleading with my eyes, silently begging him to act, to say something. His face was a mask of pale, paralyzed horror. He was staring at his mother, Mrs. Vanderlink, who was now giving him a look of cold, maternal warning. He was frozen, a statue of cowardice, utterly unable to prioritize me or my mother over his inherited status and his mother's disapproval. The silence stretched thick and poisonous. In that terrible, suspended moment, the chasm that separated the chasm I had desperately tried to bridge with my love, my degrees, and my relentless effort yawned wide open. I saw him not as my fiancé but as a weak, spineless boy who valued his trust fund more than my mother's dignity. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was not worth the cost of my mother's tears. The humiliation, which had been burning hot, suddenly cooled into a fierce, crystalline resolution. The love I thought I felt for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing contempt. I pulled my hand away from his limp grasp as if touching something vile. I didn't care about the engagement ring, the future, the social standing, or the money. All that mattered was getting my mother out. I pushed back my chair with a jarring scrape that finally broke the suffocating silence. Ignoring the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the surrounding guests, I grabbed my mother's arm. Her skin felt cold and fragile beneath my fingers. "We are leaving," I whispered to her, my voice tight and low, vibrating with a controlled fury that I hoped masked the tremor in my soul. I hauled her to her feet. She was shaking, but she allowed me to guide her, leaning heavily against me. I felt the weight of every single eye in that massive, gilded room drilling into my back as we began our retreat. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't look at Veronica, who was now basking in her triumph. I focused only on the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom. Each step was an agonizing effort, a public admission of defeat, yet also an act of fierce defiance. I was defeated. Yes, my dream of integration into this world was shattered. But I would not stay to be mocked, and I would not allow my mother to endure another second of this vile spectacle. I was forfeiting my entire future, walking away from the security I had worked so hard to attain. But the price of remaining the price of my mother's dignity was simply too high. I focused on the doors, the polished wood seeming miles away. I heard the murmurs starting up again behind us, soft and insidious, the vultures beginning to circle the ruins of the engagement. Let them talk. I thought, a cold, hard kernel of hatred forming in my chest. They can have their precious pedigree. I will take my mother and our honor. We were almost there. Just a few more feet, and we would be swallowed by the anonymity of the New York night. I could feel the cold despair closing in, the deep, heavy realization that my life had just irrevocably changed for the worse. But at least we would be free of this suffocating, poisonous air. I pushed my mother faster, desperate for escape. I just needed to survive the final, crushing walk to the threshold. The shame was a physical fire, scorching the skin on my back, a relentless heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I focused only on the heavy oak doors, those massive, carved barriers that promised escape and oblivion. Every step I took felt like wading through thick, poisonous molasses. The murmurs behind me were starting to rise again, the low, hungry hum of the social vultures beginning to pick clean the carcass of my engagement and my dignity. I could hear the sharp, triumphant laughter of Veronica cutting through the noise, a sound so cruel and sharp it made my teeth ache. I gripped my mother's arm tighter, feeling the fragile bone beneath the silk. Her body was shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. I had to get her out. I had to shield her from the lingering echo of that horrific word Maid. It wasn't about the truth of her past. It was about the intention behind the insult, the calculated cruelty designed to strip us bare in front of Manhattan's elite. I was defeated, yes, utterly and profoundly, but I would not let them witness our final collapse. I would forfeit the entire future I had meticulously built with Ethan, just to remove my mother from their sight. We were inches from the threshold. I could already taste the cool, anonymous air of the New York night, the promise of the street, the sanctuary of a taxi. My vision tunneled, focused solely on the polished brass handles of the doors. Then, the world shattered. The doors didn't simply open. They were flung inward, with a decisive, deafening violence that ripped through the genteel quiet of the ballroom. The impact resonated through the marble floor and up into my own trembling bones. The sound was not merely wood against wall. It was an explosive punctuation mark, silencing every murmur, every laugh, every whisper instantly and absolutely. I stopped dead, my feet rooted to the spot. The crystal chandeliers above us, which had been reflecting the soft, warm light of inherited wealth, suddenly began to sway precariously, catching the light in sharp, menacing flashes. A few loose shards of ice tinkled down from a serving tray nearby, the only sound besides the ragged catch of my mother's breath beside me. Standing framed in the doorway, silhouetted momentarily against the harsh exterior light, was a figure of immense, undeniable authority. The sheer force of his presence seemed to compress the air in the room, making it thin and difficult to breathe. My eyes immediately locked onto the uniform. It was immaculate, a deep, midnight blue that seemed to absorb the light. I saw the flash of gold, not the ornate, gaudy gold of the Vanderlink's jewelry, but the severe, burnished gold of rank. Medals and ribbons covered the left breast, meticulously aligned, each one a testament to decades of service, sacrifice, and command. The insignia on his shoulders were heavy, intricate, and utterly recognizable. My mind, still reeling from the shock of the insult, struggled to process the unexpected drama, the military precision that had just invaded this temple of old money. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", perfectly composed, radiating a controlled power that was terrifying in its stillness. His hair was cropped short, silver at the temples, highlighting the sharp, defined lines of his face. This was not a man accustomed to asking permission. This was a man who gave orders that determined the fate of fleets and nations. I stared, my chest tightening painfully, a cold dread mixing with an utterly impossible, dizzying recognition. The face older now than the last time I had seen a photograph, etched with the deep lines of command and heavy responsibility, was unmistakable. The high cheekbones, the piercing, light gray eyes, the jaw set in permanent, uncompromising resolve. Admiral Theodore Ted Miller. The name echoed in the vast, empty cavern of my mind. A siren blaring through the fog of shock. My father. The realization was not a gentle dawning. It was a catastrophic collision. It hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the remaining air from my lungs. The secrecy, the absence, the quiet, almost monastic life my mother had insisted we led it, was all, suddenly, violently explained by the sheer weight of this man's existence. He wasn't merely a successful businessman who traveled a lot, as my mother had vaguely suggested. He was a political and military titan, a figure of national security and immense, tangible power. I felt my mother's body jerk violently beside me. Her hand, which had been limp and defeated, suddenly clamped down on my forearm with an almost desperate strength. I looked at her, and her tear-streaked face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, not of him, but of the exposure. The decades of carefully maintained silence, of living under the radar, had just been destroyed by a pair of flung-open doors. The Admiral's gaze, which had been sweeping the room with a professional, dismissive air, landed on us. He saw my mother's ravaged face, the tears still tracking paths through her makeup, the rigid, humiliated posture I held. His expression, which had been neutral, hardened instantly into something cold and lethal. The air temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then, his eyes, sharp and unforgiving, locked onto Veronica. Veronica, who moments before had been basking in her cruel victory, was now staring back, frozen mid-smirk. Her predatory confidence dissolved instantly. I watched her perfectly sculpted features crumble, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked comprehension. She knew who he was. Everyone in that room, from the most junior aide to the most powerful patriarch, knew who Admiral Miller was. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed with terrifying speed. The snobbery, the contempt, the careless arrogance that had defined this place just seconds ago evaporated. It was replaced by a palpable, suffocating silence, heavy with pure, terrified deference. The Vanderlink's wealth, their lineage, their meticulously curated social standing, all of it, suddenly seemed trivial, cheap, and utterly powerless in the face of this man's earned authority. I felt a dizzying surge of vindication so intense it almost made me dizzy. The shame that had been burning my back was suddenly replaced by a cold, fierce, exhilarating pride. This was not just a father. This was retribution, delivered in a deep blue dress uniform. He took one step into the room, and the effect was electrifying. He wasn't merely occupying space, he was claiming it. Every eye followed him. Even Ethan, who had been staring uselessly at his champagne flute, finally looked up, his face pale and bewildered, trying to compute how the quiet, modest woman he was marrying could possibly be connected to this force of nature. My father didn't bother with pleasantries or greetings. He didn't acknowledge the Vanderlink's terrified host, Mr. Vanderlink, who was visibly wilting. He simply spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like polished steel. It wasn't loud, but it was perfectly modulated, trained to command attention over the roar of a carrier deck. "I believe," he stated, the words measured and precise. "I heard someone mention the maid's daughter." The effect was instantaneous. Veronica gasped, a pathetic, strangled sound. The entire room collectively held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But there was no explosion. There was only controlled, surgical dismantling. My father stepped fully into the light, allowing the gold of his insignia to catch the chandelier's glow. He didn't look at the Vanderlink's wealth. He looked through it, finding it utterly meaningless. He was assessing the room, and finding it wanting. I felt my mother's grip on my arm loosen slightly, replaced by a trembling awe. She was watching him, perhaps seeing the man she had loved and hidden for decades re-emerge in this spectacular, terrifying display of power. He focused his immense, unwavering attention directly on the Vanderlink family unit, Mr. and Mrs. Vanderlink, their faces frozen in horror, and Veronica, who was now visibly shaking. "I am Admiral Miller," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "And this is my family. I watched Mr. Vanderlink, the man whose corporate empire rested heavily on lucrative government defense contracts and political goodwill, turn a sickly, alarming shade of gray." The comprehension hit them all simultaneously. This wasn't just a social faux pas. This was a catastrophic political blunder. A potentially career-ending insult hurled at a man who held genuine, non-transferable authority in Washington and beyond. They had not just insulted a woman, they had insulted a Titan's daughter. Mrs. Vanderlink, usually a pillar of haughty composure, began to stammer, a pathetic, high-pitched stream of apologies and terrified excuses pouring from her lips. "Admiral, we had no idea. Sir, we were terribly mistaken." Veronica was just my father, dismissed her groveling with a single, contemptuous gesture of his hand, a movement so subtle yet so powerful it silenced her mid-sentence. He was not interested in saving their face. He was interested in justice. He turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw approval, recognition, and fierce, protective loyalty in his eyes. He wasn't just my father. He was my shield, forged in the heat of national service, now deployed for my defense. I stood straighter, feeling the weight of the Vanderlink's history lift from my shoulders, replaced by the immense, steady weight of my father's rank. I finally understood what true power looked like: not inherited title or accumulated fortune, but earned authority and unimpeachable dignity. And in that pivotal moment, I realized that I, Clara Miller, was the heir to something far more valuable than any Vanderlink could ever possess. I was the daughter of the Admiral, and their arrogance was about to cost them everything. The silence that followed his entrance was absolute, heavy, and terrifyingly new. It wasn't the awkward, predatory silence that had followed Veronica's venomous toast. This was the silence of a packed stadium when the lights suddenly fail. It was the sound of a world tilting violently on its axis. I felt the immense, steady weight of his rank pressing down on the entire room, a physical force generated by his sheer composure. My mother, still gripping my arm, had stopped weeping, replaced by a deep, shuddering gasp as she registered the man standing before Usta, ghost of her past, now an overwhelming figure of authority. He didn't move past the threshold immediately. He stood framed by the massive oak doors, allowing the full impact of his presence to register. The deep blue of his dress uniform was darker than the night sky outside, and the gold braid and ribbons seemed to catch the light from the crystal chandeliers, like tiny, dangerous flares. Then, he spoke. "I believe I heard someone mention the maid's daughter," he stated. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality I had never encountered before. Controlled resonance that seemed calibrated to travel across vast distances and command instant obedience. It sliced through the ballroom air like polished steel. It wasn't a question, it was a lethal pronouncement. I watched the color drain from Veronica's face until she resembled a poorly powdered corpse. She had been basking in her moment of cruel triumph mere seconds ago, her mouth still curled in a satisfied sneer. Now, She looked like a child caught vandalizing a national monument. My father stepped fully into the room, and the effect was electrifying. He wasn't just a powerful man in the abstract. He was Admiral Theodore Miller, a name synonymous with national security, strategic influence, and political leverage that dwarfed the Vanderlinks' inherited fortune. His gaze, cold and utterly unblinking, swept past the hundreds of guests dismissive of the diamonds, the silk, and the pedigree for locking onto the head of the household. "I am Admiral Miller," he declared, his eyes boring into Mr. Vanderlink. "And this is my family." The change in Mr. Vanderlink was instant and grotesque. His usual demeanor, carefully cultivated blend of patrician boredom and smug superiority shattered. He turned a sickly, alarming shade of gray, the color of wet cement. I could almost hear the political seismograph registering the catastrophic tremors shaking the foundation of his company. His entire fortune, I knew, was intricately tied to government defense contracts and political goodwill. He didn't just understand the social cost of insulting the Admiral. He understood the financial apocalypse it represented. Mrs. Vanderlink, the architect of my ongoing misery, reacted with immediate, groveling sycophancy. She stumbled forward, clutching her voluminous skirt, her face a mask of panicked deference. "Admiral Miller. Oh my heavens. We had no idea," she stammered, her voice high and reedy, devoid of its usual condescending timbre. "Please, accept our deepest, most profound apologies. It was a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Veronica is young. She is foolish. My father, cut her off with a single, contemptuous gesture of his hand. It was a movement used to signal a fleet, not silence a socialite, and it stopped her mid-sentence, leaving her mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic plea. Ignorance is not an excuse for malice. Mrs. Vanderlink," he stated, his voice remaining level, yet heavy with judgment. "And I assure you, there was no misunderstanding. I heard the slander quite clearly. It was deliberate, public, and directed at my wife and my daughter." His use of the word wife sent a fresh wave of shock through the room, and a dizzying surge of vindication through me. My mother, Maria, had been fiercely private about her past, ensuring that no one, especially the Vanderlinks, knew the true identity of the man she had loved and eventually married, a man whose work demanded absolute secrecy and discretion. Now, that secrecy was stripped away, replaced by a shield of unimpeachable power. I felt my stance change, the humiliating slump of defeat melting away. I stood straighter, feeling the immense protective pressure of his presence. This was what it felt like to be defended, not with nervous glances or weak excuses, but with absolute, decisive authority. Mr. Vanderlink finally managed to articulate a sound, a strangled, desperate noise that was meant to be an apology. "Admiral, please, we can discuss this privately. My office. Tomorrow, we value our relationship with the Department of Defense, and I assure you, this incident, there will be no private discussion." My father interrupted, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "What was done in public will be corrected in public." He took 2 deliberate steps further into the room, drawing all attention like a magnet. I watched the guests, the old money elite, who had enjoyed watching me squirmed out, trying desperately to appear invisible, avoiding eye contact with the man who could, and likely would, ruin their host, and perhaps them by association. They were cowards, every one of them. My father turned his attention back to Veronica, who was now visibly shaking. Her carefully constructed poise utterly evaporated. "You," he addressed her, the single word ringing out with the finality of a gavel, striking wood. "You delivered the slander. You will deliver the retraction." Veronica looked wildly at her parents, her eyes pleading for rescue, but they were too busy trying to salvage their own reputations to offer assistance. She was utterly exposed. I didn't mean it, sir," she whimpered, the theatrical drawl gone, replaced by a pathetic, choked sound. "It was just a poor joke. I apologize." My father's lip curled slightly, a tiny, devastating expression of utter contempt. "An apology offered only out of fear is worthless. Miss Vanderlink, you will look at my wife and my daughter, and you will apologize for your arrogance and your cruelty. And you will do so clearly, so that every person in this room understands the depth of your family's lack of honor." He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply commanded, and the force of his authority was such that Veronica had no choice but to obey. I watched her stumble toward us, her expensive dress suddenly looking cheap and crumpled. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes tearing up, but these were tears of pure self-pity, not remorse. She mumbled something unintelligible. "Loudly," my father instructed, his voice hardening infinitesimally. Veronica swallowed hard, her shoulders hunched. She lifted her eyes, meeting mine for the first time since the toast. The hatred was still there, but now it was laced with stark terror. I apologized to Clara and to her mother. Mrs. Miller, she forced out, her voice cracking. I regret my words. They were inappropriate and based on malicious, baseless assumptions. It was a cold, forced admission, but the power of the moment was undeniable. The humiliation that had burned so fiercely in my chest moments ago was being systematically extinguished by the icy, cleansing fire of justice. I looked at my mother, whose face was still stained with tears, but whose chin was now rising, an expression of fierce, quiet dignity returning. I realized then that the Vanderlinks had miscalculated fundamentally. They had assumed that status was defined by bank accounts and old names. My father showed them that true status was defined by service, by honor, and by the courage to stand up for those you love, regardless of the consequences. Their wealth was paper. His authority was absolute. He glanced at Mr. Vanderlink, who was now frantically motioning for a servant to bring him a glass of water, his composure utterly destroyed. The Admiral's gaze was a promise of swift, professional reprisal. Your family, my father addressed the room at large. His words echoing off the vaulted ceiling, has just demonstrated a profound lack of respect. Not merely for my family, but for the fundamental principles of dignity and common decency. This is not merely a social failing. It is a moral failure. I felt a dizzying sense of pride. He wasn't just defending me. He was denouncing their entire rotten structure. He wasn't interested in a ceasefire. He was interested in total victory. He had walked into their gilded cage and demonstrated that he held the keys to their entire existence. I finally understood why my mother had kept him a secret. He wasn't just a husband or a father. He was a force of nature. And when he entered a room, the power dynamics didn't shift. They evaporated and reformed entirely around him. The confrontation was far from over, but the victory had already been secured. The Vanderlinks were defeated, not by a counterinsults or a social slight, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of earned authority and unwavering moral clarity. I stood beside my mother, no longer the compromised exhibit in their monument to wealth, but the daughter of the Admiral, ready to witness the final, devastating verdict. The silence that followed my father's declaration was deeper and more absolute than the grave. It wasn't the silence of shock, but the silence of utter, catastrophic defeat. I watched the Vanderlinks, these titans of Manhattan society, who believed their money was an impenetrable shield, crumble under the weight of a single, unimpeachable title, Admiral Miller. My father was not finished. I knew it in the way he held his posture, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his chin that signaled he was moving from identification to judgment. He wasn't interested in a mere social victory. He was delivering a professional verdict, one that would echo far beyond the confines of this gilded cage. You have mistaken arrogance for aristocracy, he stated, his voice carrying the calm, measured authority of a man accustomed to signing orders that affected thousands of lives. He looked directly at Mr. Vanderlink, whose face was now the color of old parchment. You believe that wealth confers character. I assure you, sir, it only amplifies what is already there. Tonight, you have shown everyone in this room precisely who you are. I felt a dizzying surge of pride. He wasn't attacking their bank accounts. He was attacking their core identity. The one thing they valued more than their fortunes, their perceived superiority. Mr. Vanderlink, desperate and sweating, tried to interrupt, a whimpering sound escaping his throat. Admiral, please, this is a terrible misunderstanding. My wife, my cousin, they meant no disrespect to Maria. We were unaware of her history. My father cut him off with a gesture so minimal, yet so powerful, that it felt like a physical blow. Her history is irrelevant to your behavior. Her history is one of quiet dignity and sacrifice. Your history, as evidenced tonight, is one of petty cruelty and profound ignorance. He paused, letting his words land like artillery shells. I watched the realization dawn on Mr. Vanderlink's face. The government contracts, the political favors, the entire delicate ecosystem upon which his inherited empire rested, were suddenly precarious. He hadn't insulted a socially ambitious gold digger. He had insulted the family of a man who held the keys to major defense spending and critical intelligence access. The cost of Veronica's sneer was now being calculated in billions. My father then turned his attention to the room at large, dismissing the assembled guests with a sweeping glance that made them shift uncomfortably in their expensive clothes. I understand the nature of this society. You tolerate people based on utility or pedigree. Let me be clear. My family is neither seeking your tolerance nor your approval. We are demanding the respect we have earned. His eyes finally settled on Veronica, who was attempting to melt into the mahogany paneling behind her. She looked utterly diminished, her carefully constructed facade of icy sophistication shattered, revealing the frightened, mediocre woman underneath. "You," my father addressed her, his voice dropping slightly, making the silence surrounding her even more terrifying. "Will now issue a sincere and public apology to my wife and my daughter for the slander you delivered. It will be immediate, and it will be absolute." Veronica stammered, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked to Mrs. Vanderlink for rescue, but the matriarch was too busy trying to staunch her own political hemorrhage to offer any help. I didn't mean," Veronica choked out, tears of genuine terror, not remorse, welling in her eyes. "I am not interested in your intentions," my father clipped. "I am interested in your words and the damage they caused. Apologize, or face the consequences of challenging my family's honor." The threat was implicit but devastating. Veronica knew instinctively that the consequences would involve her being exiled from every meaningful social and professional circle in the city. Her life, built on social acceptance, would be over. With a shuddering breath that sounded loud in the cavernous room, she forced the words out. I apologize to Clara and to Maria Miller for my cruel and unfounded statement. It was despicable, and I regret it deeply." The apology was rushed, miserable, and utterly humiliating for her. I watched my mother, standing rigid beside me, take a slow, deep breath. The raw pain that had twisted her features moments ago smoothed away, replaced by a quiet, fierce dignity. The apology didn't erase the insult, but it restored the equilibrium. It was justice served cold, on a silver platter. But the final, most satisfying act of severance was yet to come. My father turned from Veronica, his focus shifting to the man who had failed us both, Ethan. Ethan stood frozen near the head table, a portrait of weak indecision. He was handsome, yes, but now, stripped of his inherited confidence, he looked utterly vacant. I realized I hadn't loved him. I had loved the idea of him, the bridge he represented, the escape from the social chasm. Seeing him now, paralyzed by his mother's disapproval and his own cowardice, I felt nothing but profound pity. My father's attention was a physical weight, crushing Ethan's remaining composure. "Ethan," the Admiral said, and the way he pronounced the name sharp and dismissive made it clear that Ethan was already irrelevant. "You are a man who claims to love my daughter. Yet when her honor and the dignity of her mother were publicly and viciously assaulted, you chose silence. You chose deference to the opinions of those without honor over the defense of the woman you supposedly wished to marry." Ethan began to protest, a pathetic, stammering defense of his panic. "Sir, I was shocked. I didn't know what to say. A leader always knows what to say, young man," my father retorted, his voice hardening into steel. "And a decent man knows when to act. You failed both tests spectacularly." I reached up and slowly, deliberately, pulled the engagement ring, a massive, inherited diamond that suddenly felt cheap and heavy from my finger. The cold metal slid off easily. I held it out, not to Ethan, but to my father, a silent declaration of my freedom. My father took the ring, turning it over once in his palm before dropping it onto the pristine white tablecloth. The faint, metallic clink sounded deafening in the silence. It was the sound of a future being irrevocably cancelled. "The engagement is terminated," my father announced, his gaze sweeping over the Vanderlinks, ensuring they understood the finality. "Immediately, irrevocably. My daughter deserves a man whose backbone is made of something stronger than inherited money. She deserves a man who understands that true wealth is integrity, not assets." Ethan looked utterly panicked, realizing that his weakness had cost him not just a fiancé, but a catastrophic loss of face and, potentially, future political leverage. He had lost everything by doing nothing. A wave of profound, exhilarating relief washed over me. The knot of dread that had lived in my stomach for months, the constant pressure to conform, to be good enough for their world dissolved, instantly. I wasn't just walking away from an engagement. I was walking away from a life of perpetual apology. I stood taller than I had ever stood in that house, my shoulders back, my eyes level. I looked at my mother, and she gave me the faintest, most beautiful smile, a smile of shared vindication. My father placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and validating. It was the first time I had felt that solid, unwavering support from him, and it grounded me completely. "We are done here," he stated simply, turning toward the grand oak doors. This time, our exit was not a desperate flight from humiliation. It was a formal, powerful departure. My father led the way, his imposing silhouette framed by the doorway. My mother, Maria, walked beside me, her head held high, every trace of tears gone. We walked with the slow, measured pace of people who had won. As we reached the threshold, I paused for a single, defining moment and looked back at the ballroom. The sight was intoxicating. The Vanderlinks were huddled together, whispering furiously, their faces etched with horror and realization. The guests were statues, silent witnesses to their downfall. They hadn't just lost a social engagement. They had been publicly humbled by a man whose power was earned through service, not inherited through luck. I saw Veronica weeping openly, her expensive dress now looking like a ridiculous costume. I saw Ethan staring at the abandoned ring, utterly defeated. They had called me the Maid's daughter, believing they could diminish me with a petty insult based on a false assumption. They never stopped to consider that the daughter of a woman of such quiet strength might also be the daughter of a man who commanded the respect of the nation. Stepping out of the mansion and onto the cold marble steps, the crisp New York air hit my face. It was sharp, clean, and refreshing. The heavy, suffocating air of the gilded cage was behind me. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the Vanderlinks' history lift from my soul. I was Clara Miller, daughter of Maria, and daughter of Admiral Theodore Miller. My worth was not measured by the size of a diamond or the age of a family name. It was measured by the integrity of the people I loved and the dignity I carried. We got into the waiting black car, and as the vehicle pulled away from the monument to their arrogance, I didn't look back again. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had walked away from their world, and I had done so a queen.